Get him out of my hotel.
Are you absolutely certain? Thank you.
Officer, remove him now. No, sir. He has done nothing wrong.
No, it can't be.
You remember it.
You built this place.
You shouldn't be in here.
I came to see what became of my hotel.
This meeting is officially suspended.
Who are you? I'm the man who built this hotel.
No one in the lobby of the Crown Spire Grand recognized the frail black man trembling slightly beside a wooden cane. His name appeared on the reservation list, confirmed and paid in full. Yet the manager looked through him with practiced contempt and declared the property was not meant for someone like him. When he asked for a second review, the front desk attendant offered a thin smile. A security officer stepped forward, and the executive standing on the upper balcony gave a slow, approving nod. What none of them understood was that the worn gold ring on his left hand was the symbol of the man who had built this place from a crumbling shell of a building 4 decades ago. Before midnight, every one of them would be gone. If you believe dignity has nothing to do with what a person wears or how old they happen to be, stay with this story until the very end. The morning it began, Silas Kingsley was sitting in the sunroom of his estate outside Westbridge, a cup of chamomile tea cooling at his elbow, when the unmarked envelope arrived with no return address and no explanation. He had spent nearly 8 months recovering from open-heart surgery, and in that time, he had handed operational authority over Crownspire Hospitality to the man the board had selected in his absence, a Queern CEO named Conrad Ashford, who wore tailored suits and spoke about modernization the way politicians spoke about change, loudly and without precision. Silas had read Conrad's quarterly reports, had noted the language that buried discomfort inside growth projections, and had felt, without being able to name it precisely, that something inside the company was being quietly rearranged. The envelope confirmed that feeling with the cold specificity of documentation. Inside, he found a single old room key card, one of the original brass inlaid cards from the Crown Spire Grand's first year of operation, and a handwritten note on plain white stock. Come to Crown Spire Grand alone. The hotel you built no longer welcomes people like you. Beneath the note was a folded sheet containing a summary of guest complaints that had been buried before reaching the board. Elderly visitors turned away without cause. Black guests subjected to repeated credential checks that white guests of similar appearance were never asked to undergo. Longtime employees pressured into early resignation, and a series of unaccounted line items appearing in the operational books under maintenance categories that did not correspond to any work orders. Silas read everything twice, set the papers on the side table, and finished his tea before picking up the phone to call Celeste Davenport. Celeste was the kind of lawyer who kept her voice even in precisely the situations where other people raised theirs, and when Silas told her what he intended to do, she was quiet for 4 full seconds before responding. He would check into the Crown Spire Grand as an ordinary guest using his real name and identity, but without any staff notification, any security detail, or any advance coordination with management. Celeste argued that his health made this reckless, and that any number of investigators could perform the same audit without risk to him personally. Silas listened to her with the patience of a man who had already made his decision and was simply extending courtesy by hearing the objection. He told her that a system could not be accurately evaluated when the people inside it knew the owner was watching, that he needed to see the hotel as every unrecognized guest saw it, and that he would contact her the moment he needed legal intervention. She extracted one concession. She would be reachable throughout the night and prepared to mobilize immediately on his word. Before leaving, he went to the hall closet and retrieved the jacket he had worn on the day the Crown Spire Grand first opened its doors. It was a charcoal wool blazer with a slightly frayed left cuff, soft from decades of occasional use, the kind of garment that made no statement about wealth or position. He put it on over a plain white shirt, checked that his identification and reservation confirmation were in the breast pocket, alongside the small copper key his late wife Lenora had pressed into his hand on the morning of that first opening, and walked out to the car. A few blocks from the hotel, he asked the driver to stop and let him out. He wanted to walk the final distance himself, the same way he had walked it 41 years ago, when Lenora had been beside him and the building ahead had been their entire bet on the future. Preston Vale had been watching the lobby camera feeds from his office upstairs when the system flagged an incoming reservation check-in. He made one phone call, said 4 words. He actually came then, and set down the receiver with the measured composure of a man who believed he had already won. The Crown Spire Grand occupied a full city block in central Westbridge and had been, in its original conception, a place where excellence was measured by the quality of the mattress and the sincerity of the greeting, rather than by the cost of the room. The lobby's double staircase was still faced in the Carrara marble that Silas and Lenora had selected together from a sample catalog spread across their kitchen table, and the vaulted ceiling still carried the original coffered plasterwork that Lenora had insisted on when the contractor suggested a cheaper alternative. What had changed, and what Silas registered within 30 seconds of crossing the threshold, was that the framed portrait of the hotel's founders, a photograph he had resisted displaying for 15 years before the board convinced him it was right, had been replaced by a backlit promotional panel featuring Conrad Ashford's face above a tagline about visionary leadership. Silas walked to the front desk and placed his reservation confirmation and identification in front of the attendant on duty. Her name tag read Blythe Carraway, Director of Front-of-House Operations, and she looked at the documents the way people look at things they have already decided are not worth examining. Her eyes moved from the confirmation number to his jacket, to his cane, to his shoes, and Silas watched her make the calculation in real time. She turned the monitor screen slightly away from him, typed something, and then looked up with the particular expression of professional regret that is entirely manufactured. She told him with practiced smoothness that the hotel was fully booked and that no room matching his reservation remained available. Silas said nothing for a moment. Then he directed her attention to a couple standing 3 feet to his left at the adjacent desk, who had just been offered an unsolicited room upgrade despite having no prior reservation in the system. He had heard the exchange clearly. Blythe shifted position and changed her explanation without acknowledging the shift, telling him instead that there appeared to be a problem with his payment method. When he produced a second card and set it beside the first, she moved the goalposts a 3rd time, informing him that rooms at his booking tier now required a security deposit of $10,000, payable immediately in cash or certified transfer, a requirement that appeared in no published policy, and that she could not produce in writing when he asked to see the documentation. Silas understood at that point that this was not an error in the system. He asked, with the controlled quietness that had always been more unnerving to the people around him than any raised voice, to be connected with the property's general manager. Preston Vale appeared within 4 minutes, which suggested he had already been positioned nearby, and he arrived, without apology and without the vocabulary of resolution. He suggested, with the kind of practiced condescension that requires years of uninterrupted practice, that Silas might find accommodations elsewhere in the city better suited to his situation. Gesturing vaguely in the direction of the door, Silas asked him directly whether the hotel was declining to honor a confirmed reservation on the basis of the guest's physical appearance. Vale did not answer the question. Instead, he turned to the desk, placed 2 fingers on Silas's confirmation printout, and instructed Blythe to void the booking. She executed the cancellation on screen before Silas could object, and the transaction was gone. On Blythe's phone, partially visible from where Silas stood, a message from Conrad Ashford read, "Keep going. Do not let him upstairs." Grant Latham had been with Crown Spire's security division for 11 years, long enough to have developed a reliable instinct for the difference between a guest who was causing a problem and a guest who was being made into one. He arrived at the front desk with 2 members of his team after Preston Vale's call, and he looked at the situation with professional attention before moving. What he saw was an elderly man with a confirmed reservation, standing quietly without threatening anyone, whose hands were trembling with the kind of fine motor instability that follows cardiac events. He saw nothing that constituted grounds for physical removal. Preston ordered him to escort the guest to the exterior. Grant set down the order, walked to the concierge station, retrieved a chair, and brought it to where Silas was standing. He then requested that the hotel's on-duty medical attendant come to the lobby, not because Silas had asked for help, but because a man in visible physical discomfort was standing in a building Grant was responsible for, and that was sufficient reason. Preston's response was immediate and loud enough that several nearby guests turned to look. He told Grant that his failure to follow a direct instruction was a terminable offense, and that Grant should consider carefully what he was choosing. Grant considered it for approximately 2 seconds and arranged for a glass of water to be brought alongside the chair. The confrontation drew attention from the room, in the way these things always do, not with sudden noise but with a gradual shift in collective awareness, guests at the bar tilting their heads, a family near the elevator pausing mid-conversation. Blythe attempted to redirect the narrative before it could settle, speaking at a volume calibrated to be heard by the people nearest to Silas, suggesting to a colleague that the guest in question might be presenting fraudulent identification using language carefully chosen to reframe a man being denied his rightful accommodation as a potential security threat. Silas noticed the technique. He had been in enough boardrooms to recognize the construction of a public justification in real time. He also noticed who remained silent. Most of the front-of-house staff kept their eyes on their screens or their feet. One junior bellman looked at Silas with an expression that was somewhere between recognition and sorrow. And then, crossing the far end of the lobby with a cart of folded linens, a woman in a gray service uniform glanced in his direction and stopped. Her name tag read Nomi Brooks, and she had been with this hotel for longer than most of the management team had worked in hospitality. She was looking at something specific, not at Silas's face, which she did not yet recognize with certainty, but at his left hand, where the copper key hung from a short chain looped through his fingers. She recognized that key. She had been present the morning it was shown to the assembled staff as a symbol of what the hotel was meant to stand for. She did not speak his name. She came forward, asked quietly whether he needed any assistance, and was immediately redirected by Preston Vale in a tone that carried the unmistakable implication that her continued employment was contingent on her returning to the service corridor without further engagement. She went. But before she turned, Silas closed her hand gently around the copper key and said 4 words, "Take me where they don't want me looking." Naomi led him through the service passage behind the laundry facility and up a staff stairwell to the second-floor break room used by the housekeeping division, a narrow space that smelled of institutional coffee and floor cleaner, furnished with 4 folding chairs and a table covered in maintenance schedules and shift sign-in sheets. She closed the door, sat across from him, and confirmed what he had already concluded. She told him she had written the letter. She had spent 3 years watching the hotel change under Conrad Ashford's operational directives, and not in ways that showed up in the promotional language about rebranding and elevated guest experience. The change she had witnessed was structural and deliberate. Shortly after Ashford assumed authority, a set of informal guidelines had circulated through middle management under the heading of brand image protection, which in practice functioned as a system by which frontline staff were given discretion and quiet encouragement to turn away guests judged visually unsuitable for the property's new positioning. No document used that language explicitly. The instruction was conveyed through the approval or disapproval of individual decisions. Employees who turned away certain guests received good performance evaluations. Employees who pushed back found their hours cut or their assignments changed. Formal complaints from guests, when they reached the inbox of the guest relations coordinator, were reviewed and filtered before any report could travel to the oversight layer of the company. Complaints describing racial bias, age-based dismissal, or denial of confirmed reservations were marked as resolved without investigation and archived where no one with authority to act on them would encounter them. Naomi had begun keeping copies 18 months ago. Emails printed from a shared terminal, scanned maintenance invoices, a record of shift reassignments cross-referenced with the dates employees had attempted to file internal objections. She had compiled everything onto an external drive and had not known who to give it to, because every internal reporting channel returned to a desk controlled by Preston Vale or Conrad Ashford. The letter to Silas was, as she put it, her last option before everything she had documented became useless. She told him there was something else. That evening's event, the investment dinner assembled in the grand ballroom and the mezzanine reception area, was not a routine hospitality industry gathering. It was a private meeting with representatives of Valecourt Capital, a real estate investment consortium that had been in quiet negotiation with Conrad Ashford for several months. The substance of those negotiations had not been disclosed to the full board. Naomi had intercepted a catering memo that referenced a private agreement framework and had found enough contextual detail in subsequent documents to understand that Ashford was positioning a significant asset sale that he had structured to proceed without triggering the shareholder approval thresholds that should have applied. Silas absorbed this without expression. He told Naomi that he was beginning to understand why his arrival had been handled the way it was. Being denied a room was not an accident of institutional indifference. It was a component of a larger plan, and someone had wanted him in this building tonight for reasons that were not about hospitality. She opened a saved email on her phone and held it toward him. The subject line read, "Contingency Declaration, Founder Competency Status." The email was a planning document, not a final decision, but its structure made the intent unmistakable. Conrad Ashford had prepared a scenario in which Silas Kingsley, provoked by public humiliation at the property he had built, responded with anger sufficient to be captured on camera, and that footage was subsequently presented to the board as evidence of cognitive and behavioral decline following his cardiac surgery. The supporting narrative was already drafted. A founding figure in deteriorating health, no longer capable of sound judgment, publicly demonstrating an inability to manage emotional response in a professional environment. The document referenced applicable provisions in the corporate charter that allowed a board majority to move a controlling shareholder to advisory status under defined medical circumstances, and it outlined a timeline in which, once that reclassification was in place, the Valecourt transaction could be ratified without requiring Silas's vote or consent. The design of the evening became clear in its entirety. The reservation denial, the escalation at the desk, Blythe's suggestion of fraudulent documentation, the security approach. Each element was calibrated to produce a reaction, and each reaction would have been recorded by the hotel's own camera system, which fed to a monitoring station that Conrad controlled. The plan required Silas to perform his own undoing in public, and it had very nearly worked, except that Silas had not responded the way the plan required. He had not raised his voice. He had not made demands that could be described as irrational. He had asked clear questions and produced valid documentation, and waited with the stillness of a man who had spent a lifetime understanding that power exerted quietly is power that endures. He borrowed Naomi's phone and called Celeste. He told her to activate the emergency inspection rights held by the controlling shareholder under Article 9 of the Corporate Charter, and to contact Evelyn Whitlock, the chair of the Independent Governance Committee, directly, not through the Ashford-managed communications channel. He told her to bring the auditing team he had retained confidentially 3 weeks earlier because he had suspected something like this was coming even before the envelope arrived. He told her not to announce his presence or his identity to anyone inside the building until he gave her the word. He wanted Conrad to continue his dinner, to continue making promises to the Valecourt representatives, to continue generating evidence that a prosecutor would eventually find useful. Preston Vale found the service corridor access had been used without authorization and initiated a sweep of the staff areas. His team began moving systematically through the second floor, which meant Naomi and Silas had to move through the kitchen corridor, past the loading dock, and through the equipment maintenance passage that ran along the building's north interior wall. It was not a dignified route for a 79-year-old man 6 months out of cardiac surgery, and Naomi monitored Silas with the contained anxiety of someone who understood she was responsible for keeping him upright. He stopped twice to regulate his breathing. He refused, both times, to go back. What he saw during that transit: the underprepared fire suppression equipment tagged for inspection dates that had passed, the catering inventory records showing premium goods ordered in quantities that did not correspond to the food actually served, the junior kitchen staff working conditions that no one in the executive tier would have tolerated for themselves. All of it registered. He said nothing. He filed it. Preston found them in the maintenance corridor and announced that Conrad Ashford wanted to meet the elderly man who had been disrupting operations. The ballroom mezzanine was set with the particular elegance of a room designed to make money feel comfortable, and Conrad Ashford moved through it with the ease of a man who had spent 2 years practicing the performance of ownership. He was mid-sentence when Preston Vale led Silas back into the main reception space, and he completed the sentence before acknowledging the interruption, which was a small theatrical choice that told Silas everything he still needed to know about how this man understood power. Conrad looked at Silas with the studied blankness of someone pretending not to recognize a face they have been studying for months. He addressed the room, not Silas, asking in a tone of puzzled hospitality why a guest without accommodations had been found in the restricted staff areas of the property. Several of the Vale Court representatives, men and women in expensive evening wear holding champagne that cost more per glass than Naomi's hourly wage, turned to look. Silas met Conrad's gaze and asked whether he was certain he wanted to resolve this particular matter in front of the people he was asking to invest their capital. Conrad was certain. He had the cameras running, his legal team on standby, and his narrative already composed. He gestured to Preston, to Blythe, and to the security team flanking the room's perimeter, and issued the instruction to remove Silas from the property. Grant Latham, standing near the entrance, did not move. He stated clearly, and without aggression, that the guest in question had not violated any documented policy, and that he would not participate in the removal. Conrad looked at him for 3 seconds, then terminated his employment on the spot, in front of 64 witnesses, which was a decision that would later require its own legal explanation. Naomi stepped forward from the staff corridor entrance and announced that she possessed documentation demonstrating that management directives issued from this executive team violated both corporate policy and applicable civil accommodation law. Preston moved toward her, calling her action an unauthorized disclosure of proprietary company data and demanding that she surrender the external drive she was carrying. She held it behind her back and did not surrender it. Conrad allowed Silas to stand there for another moment, watching him, before speaking the sentence he had apparently been rehearsing. He said that a man who had built something beautiful in his prime was not the same as a man who could protect it in his decline, and that holding on to the past was not the same as leading toward a future. The main entrance to the ballroom opened. Celeste Davenport walked in first, wearing her reading glasses and carrying a legal portfolio that had the density of something assembled over weeks rather than hours. Evelyn Whitlock came in beside her, followed by 3 members of the independent board committee and 2 representatives from the external audit firm Silas had retained. The large presentation screen behind Conrad, the one that had been cycling through branded imagery of Ashford-era crown spire, went dark. After a moment it illuminated again with a single photograph. Silas Kingsley and Lenora Kingsley, standing before the Crown Spire grand entrance on the morning of its first public opening, his hand on the door, her hand on his arm, both of them looking at the camera with the expression of people who have just done something they intend to spend their lives protecting. Celeste turned to face the room and said, "I'd like to introduce Silas Kingsley, holder of 58% of the voting rights in this corporation." The ballroom held its silence, the way a room holds a sound after it has stopped, not empty, but resonant with what had just occurred. Blythe Carraway stood at the edge of the reception table, looking at the name on the reservation confirmation she had voided 2 hours earlier. A name she had read and processed and deliberately dismissed because the man attached to it had not looked the way she had decided. Valuable guests were supposed to look. Preston Vale had one hand partially covering the cancellation authorization he had signed, as though he could place his palm over a document and remove it from the record of the evening. Silas rose from the chair Grant had brought him 2 hours earlier, moving with deliberate slowness that had nothing apologetic in it. He did not raise his voice. He asked a sequence of questions, directing each to a specific person, and waiting for the answer before moving to the next. He asked Blythe, who had processed his reservation, and confirmed the room block was available. At the time, she told him the hotel was full. He asked who in the building had known the property held available inventory while she was delivering that statement. He asked Preston to identify, on the record, and in front of the assembled board members, who had issued the instruction to deny service. He asked the security coordinator on duty to confirm who had directed the deployment to the lobby. He asked Conrad, finally, whether he had known the identity of the guest being denied service before those instructions were issued. The responses formed a chain that no one had intended to make visible. Blythe assigned the decision to Preston. Preston described his actions as consistent with directives from executive leadership. Conrad called it a security protocol that had been misapplied, a subordinate initiative he had not personally authorized, a test of lobby procedure that had unfortunately been mishandled. Each answer moved responsibility in the direction it was trying to avoid. Celeste presented the board with 3 categories of evidence. The first was the system log from the reservation platform, showing the room availability status at the moment. Blythe had claimed full occupancy, time-stamped and unalterable. The second was the internal message thread between Conrad and Blythe, retrieved from the hotel's communication server under the Emergency Audit Authority. Celeste had invoked 40 minutes earlier, in which Conrad had instructed, in language that left no interpretive space, that the incoming guest was not to be given access to the property. The third was the signed cancellation authorization that Preston had completed with apparent confidence that it would never be reviewed by anyone with the power to treat it as evidence. Naomi delivered the external drive. The audit team began its extraction immediately, projecting a portion of the contents. The informal guest classification guidelines, the complaint suppression records, the shift adjustment logs cross-referenced with employee objection dates. Onto the screen that had, 15 minutes earlier, been displaying Conrad Ashford's promotional biography. Silas announced that the corporate charter provisions governing shareholder protection allowed the controlling interest holder to immediately suspend executive officers whose conduct demonstrated fraud, discriminatory practice, or material harm to the organization's legal standing and public obligations. He applied those provisions in sequence. Conrad Ashford was suspended from all executive functions pending investigation. Preston Vale was removed from his position as general manager effective immediately. Blythe Caraway was removed from her role as front-of-house director. 2 middle-tier operations managers who had administered the complaint suppression system were suspended. 3 additional staff members who had directly participated in the documentation falsification were placed on administrative hold pending review. Grant Latham was reinstated to his position with full back pay for the portion of the evening following his termination, which Celeste noted in the record would be calculated to the minute. Naomi Brooks was formally designated as a protected disclosure source under applicable whistleblower statutes and appointed, on an interim basis, to the newly created position of Director of Guest Standards, effective until the conclusion of the independent investigation. Conrad had remained composed through most of this, with the particular composure of someone who still believed he was holding the decisive card. He reached into the interior pocket of his jacket and placed a document on the table. The executed agreement with Valecourt Capital, signed earlier that day. He told the room that whatever authority Silas could exercise over personnel decisions, the asset transfer was a binding contractual instrument that predated the evening's events, and that unwinding it would expose the corporation to a penalty structure approaching $1 billion. He said Silas could fire him if he chose, but the hotel was already gone. The board withdrew to the private conference room on the third floor, and the atmosphere inside it was the specific atmosphere of people who have just been shown that the situation they thought they understood is considerably more complicated than they had believed. Evelyn Whitlock sat at the table's head and said nothing for the first 2 minutes, which was its own form of communication. Conrad presented the financial argument with disciplined clarity. Regardless of the methods used to reach this point, the Vail Court transaction addressed a genuine capital shortfall in the corporation's balance sheet, a shortfall that had developed over several years and that represented a structural vulnerability no strategic pivot could resolve without external capital. He produced a summary document showing the deficit figures and noted that several board members had received preliminary briefings on the fiscal situation without being told the proposed solution. Some of those members shifted in their chairs with the discomfort of people who are recognizing, in public, that they had accepted partial information and treated it as complete. Silas did not argue against the numbers. He asked the lead auditor to place the Crownspire financial statements alongside the dataset Naomi had compiled, and to identify any discrepancies in the capitalization of fees paid to external consulting entities over the preceding 22 months. The process took 11 minutes. What it revealed was a systematic transfer of operational funds, distributed across 8 separate vendor relationships, each structured to fall below the individual transaction thresholds that would have triggered automatic board notification, into a set of consulting firms that shared no clients, produced no documented deliverables, and carried no staff on payroll. The aggregate sum was substantial. The trail connecting those firms to the Ashford family's financial interests was not sophisticated enough to survive professional scrutiny, which suggested it had been constructed with confidence that professional scrutiny would never be applied. Celeste then raised the Vail Court contract itself. She directed the room's attention to an addendum in the final pages, written in the compressed contractual language that relies on readers not reading until the end. The addendum granted the acquiring party the right to exercise an asset conversion option within 180 days of closing, which in practice meant the right to demolish the Crownspire Grand Building and sell the underlying land parcel to a commercial developer whose identity was not disclosed in the contract. The Vail Court transaction was not a rescue of the Crownspire Hospitality Group. It was a mechanism for extracting the land value of the hotel's flagship property while manufacturing the appearance of a corporate restructuring. Conrad had not been attempting to save the company. He had been constructing the conditions for its controlled destruction in a form that would generate substantial personal compensation from the acquiring side, while leaving the public-facing narrative of a struggling business making necessary decisions. Evelyn Whitlock asked Silas one question before she cast her vote. She asked whether, given the physical demands the evening had already placed on him, he intended to return to active executive management of the corporation, and whether the board could be confident that doing so would not create its own category of institutional risk. Silas answered without hesitation. He told her he had no intention of reclaiming the chief executive role. What he intended was to restore the oversight mechanisms that Conrad had systematically dismantled, to identify and install a leadership team with both the operational competency and the ethical orientation the position required, and to ensure that the asset his wife had helped him build from nothing could not be converted into a transaction footnote by someone who had been trusted to protect it. He said this was not about his legacy. It was about the people who worked in the building and the guests who trusted the building's name, and both groups deserved better stewardship than they had received. The vote was called. Conrad still held commitments from 2 board members whose affiliations with his network had not yet been fully scrutinized. The initial count returned tied, and the deciding vote was Evelyn Whitlock's. Before she raised her hand, Naomi spoke from the corner of the room where she had been standing with the quiet self-containment of someone who has decided to be present for the moment their 3 years of risk are either validated or wasted. She said there was one detail in the maintenance invoicing records she had not yet submitted, because she had not understood its relevance until the Vale Court connection became clear. A firm called Ashford Heritage Consulting had received a total of 4 invoices from Crown Spire's facilities budget over 14 months, all categorized under guest suite renovation. The actual renovation work they corresponded to did not appear in any contractor log, permit filing, or material delivery record. Ashford Heritage Consulting, she had since confirmed, was a registered entity whose principal beneficial owner was a member of Conrad Ashford's immediate family. A portion of the funds received by that entity had subsequently been transferred to a real estate investment vehicle that shared 2 principals with the Vale Court Capital Consortium. The auditor reviewed the documentation on the spot. He confirmed that what Naomi had described constituted a direct financial relationship between Crown Spire's acting chief executive and the party on the other side of the asset transaction he had been advancing without full board disclosure. The term for this was not unusual business practice. The term for this was self-dealing, and it rendered the Vale Court contract voidable under the corporate charter's conflict of interest provisions, independent of any other finding from the evening. Evelyn Whitlock voted to immediately suspend the Vale Court transaction, to refer the complete financial record to the appropriate regulatory and investigative authorities, and to affirm the controlling shareholders' personnel decisions as exercised within his documented rights. The vote carried. Conrad made one attempt to leave the conference room ahead of the formal conclusion of proceedings. Celeste's team intercepted him at the door, not physically but procedurally. A formal document retention request requiring him to surrender his corporate devices and system access credentials before departing the premises. The men from Vale Court, who had spent the past hour watching an investment dinner become something else entirely, collected their coats from the ballroom coat check and departed without speaking to anyone. Silas returned to the lobby. He stood near the concierge desk and addressed the assembled staff, the junior employees, the bellman, the kitchen workers who had come to the service entrance to hear what had happened. And he said clearly that the people in this building who had not participated in the conduct of the evening would not carry consequences for the choices of the people who had. He said an independent review process would begin within 72 hours, staffed entirely by investigators with no prior relationship to the Ashford administration, and that any employee who wished to provide information without fear of retaliation would have a direct line to that process that bypassed every layer of hotel management. He said that the guests who had been turned away, overcharged, or treated as less than they were deserved an apology and a remedy, and they would receive both. Preston Vale and Blythe Carraway walked out through the main entrance of the Crown Spire Grand, the same entrance they had been preparing to push Silas through 2 hours earlier. Neither of them said anything. Silas looked at the signed room cancellation form that Celeste had placed in a folder during the proceedings, and he told her he wanted it preserved, not displayed as a trophy, not referenced in any press communication, but kept in a physical frame in the office of whoever next held the general manager position, as a standing reminder of the specific mechanism by which authority can be used against the very people it is constructed to serve, and of how quickly that mechanism can become normal when no one with the power to stop it is paying attention. When the last of the board members had left and the lobby had been returned to whatever version of itself it was capable of being after a night like this one, Silas told the duty manager, a young woman who had spent the evening watching from behind the business center partition, with the careful attention of someone filing everything away, that he would like to be shown to the room he had reserved, not to the presidential suite, not to any upgraded accommodation, but to the specific room that appeared on the confirmation printout Blythe had voided. Naomi retrieved a new key card and walked him to the elevator herself. Grant carried the small travel bag Silas had brought, which contained a change of clothes, his medication schedule, and a paperback novel he had been working through for 3 weeks. The lobby was quiet now. The champagne glasses had been collected. The promotional panels had been switched off. Before the elevator doors closed, Silas turned and looked at the wall where the founder's portrait had hung, before Ashford replaced it with his own image. He asked the duty manager to pass along a request to whoever was responsible for the lobby's visual presentation going forward. He did not want his photograph reinstated. He wanted a small panel in its place, in the same proportions and position, bearing a single line of text. No guest who walks through this door will ever be required to prove that they deserve to be treated with dignity. In the months that followed, the Crown Spire Grand underwent changes that were quiet where the evening had been loud. The independent investigation concluded with findings that were referred to the appropriate authorities and resolved through processes that did not require further disruption to the staff or the guests. A new general manager was selected through a process that included, as one of its explicit criteria, a demonstrated record of managing properties where service quality was not contingent on a guest's visible status. The complaint reporting system was redesigned so that no single tier of management could intercept a guest's concern before it reached an independent review body. Every front-of-house employee completed a required training program built on a principle that Silas had stated in the hotel's original operating philosophy 41 years earlier, and that had been quietly dropped from the internal documentation during the Ashford period. The measure of a hospitality operation is not what it offers to the guests it wants, but what it extends to the guests it does not immediately recognize. Naomi Brooks was confirmed as Director of Guest Standards, the first person to hold that title in the company's history, with a direct reporting relationship to the board committee rather than to hotel operations management. Grant Latham rebuilt the security department around a single reoriented mandate that the function of security in a hotel is to protect the safety of the people inside it, not to enforce the social preferences of the people running it. Silas did not take a new executive title. He attended board meetings, reviewed governance documents, and maintained the controlling interest that gave him the ability to act when action was required. He did not return to daily management. He had done what he came to do. The story of that night circulated in the way that stories of accountability circulate when they are specific enough to be true and significant enough to matter. And weeks later, on a Tuesday morning when the lobby was quiet and the new shift was just coming on, an elderly man in a plain gray coat came through the main entrance, moving slowly with the assistance of a folding cane. A junior front desk associate came around the counter before the man had reached it, held the door to the reception area open, and asked whether there was anything she could help him with. The man smiled. He said he had a reservation. She said she would be glad to take care of that for him, and she meant it. And the door that Silas Kingsley had first opened 41 years ago stayed open behind them both.